on resilience. My name is Chun. I'm a spatial econometrician at the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT of CGIAR. This session is being recorded, so I would like to ask you to mute your mic now, because I think I hear some background noise. So thank you. This session is part of the 2023 annual meeting of AAEA Applied and Agricultural Economics Association, and our session is co-organized by Purdue Center for Regional Development, PCRD at Purdue University, and the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT under CGIAR Research Initiative on Foresight and Metrics. Thanks all for joining us. It's very nice to have you. We're very happy to have you here today. Just to give you a little background of why we're organizing the session. So recently we see there's an increasing attention to building resilience, both in academic and in policy discussions. One reason is the pandemic, right? If anything we learned from COVID is that it's important to be able to handle disruptions and maintain ordinary operation and maintain well-being. Now, the fact is we live in a world that has a lot of shocks and disruptions, right? These include large-scale disruptions such as natural disaster and economic recession, but also small-scale disruption that you and me, we may face in our individual lives. And it's likely that these disruptions will continue to happen. Therefore, it's important to have a better understanding of what drives resilience and take actions today. This is why we want to organize the session, and we want to bring together recent works on resilience from different angles. And we invite speakers to come and share their experience and works on resilience from different perspectives. We're also very looking forward to hear your insights on this topic. So to give you a very quick overview of how the session is organized, very soon we will start the flash talk. We have 8 speakers. Each of them will have 3 to 4 minutes sharing their experience and work on resilience, and followed by 1 or 2 questions from Indraneel or me. And after that, we have panel discussion followed by Q&A from audience. And I want to remind you that the session is being recorded. You can post your question, comments in the chat anytime. We will address them at the Q&A session. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the first part of the flash talk. For this part, we have 4 speakers. They're from regional development centers and universities in the US. They will share their perspective and experience on economic resilience in the US. And let me introduce you the first speaker, Indraneel Kumar, also the co-organizer of the symposium. Indraneel serves as the principal regional planner at PCRD. He has a PhD from Purdue University. Indraneel will introduce economic resilience in the US, dimension of resilience, and insights and challenges. So Indraneel, thank you, and let me pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Song. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from West Lafayette, Indiana in the US Midwest. Economic resilience, or in general, resilience is about building capacities, different kinds of capacities in the region, right? So it can be resistance recovery, a shock has happened, and then how the region sustains it, or, region has the capacity to reorient itself after a shock, which usually happens, or, maybe chart a completely new path, renewal. Now, the thing is, in the practice, what we see in regional planning, regional development, at least in the US context, especially rural regions, is, they might not have any capacity at all. Or maybe academically, when we look at it, maybe one or more than one. These are a bit difficult to distinguish. And then in the literature, economic resilience has been looked up as, either single equilibrium or engineering aspect or multi-equilibrium. Regions can have multiple stages of equilibrium, or more importantly, adaptation and evolutionary, which is actually coming from evolutionary economic geographic concepts and where human beings become important. But the thing is, at least in the US context, these capacities are much needed during and after a shock. So we went through 2008, 2009 Great Recession, and there was a reason why we called it as Great Recession. It was a tremendous shock, especially to construction, manufacturing industries. And then, of course, COVID also happened. Pandemic-induced recession also happened. And in several cases, many communities actually go through industry losses. Next slide, please. So the way we try to measure it, or at least develop a metric, is in some way, it's a standardized ratio between rebound to drop, at least if we are looking at one indicator. So, pre-shock region had a path, had a trajectory, and then the shock happened. And then, either the region can recover its pathway, or, it completely takes up a new pathway. Usually in the media report, unemployment rate is the most popular measure. Means that's what is discussed, the employment levels, or rather unemployment rate has reached pre-pandemic level or pre-recession level. So we are good, but probably that may not give the entire picture. But in the literature, gross regional product, labor productivity, real earnings, innovation, employment population ratio, some of the slow moving indicators are used. But then what about, building resilience? So in US, we have United States Economic Development Administration, which is actually responsible for regional economic development. And now they are requiring that, the regional economies need to prepare themselves to anticipate risk, evaluate risk, and develop, some sort of response capacity. So what they have recommended is that the comprehensive economic development strategies document must have, this resilience component. So that's all. Thank you, Song.
Thank you, Indraneel. Very interesting and very overarching introduction of the concept of economic resilience. You mentioned different dimensions and different indicators of economic resilience. I guess the natural question would be, when you use different indicators or look at different dimensions, do they always give you the coherent conclusion, or maybe sometimes they can generate mixed message for policymakers?
So the way we try to observe is, there is one side is popular media, which actually that is what communities follow. And as I mentioned, unemployment rate is most commonly reported, but that does not give the complete picture of the shock or what is happening with the labor market or the regional economy. So it has to be multidimensional. There are different indicators that should be used. Labor participation rate, gender-based labor participation rate, employment population ratio, or even gross regional product, or some other productivity indicators can be useful. So thank you.
Thank you, Indraneel. Let me introduce the next speaker, Davis Hurtado. Davis is assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering and human rights at the University of Connecticut. And Davis will discuss the measurement of economic resilience through regional competitive indicator. Davis, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you, Son, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Just building on what Indraneel just mentioned, and I also wanted to say greetings from, in this case will be Connecticut, but actually I am traveling, so greetings from the city of Cusco in Peru. Just to go back to what we were discussing on resilience, one of the, if we pass to the next slide, please. One of the key interesting aspects about resilience that perhaps is very obvious, yet sometimes is ignored, is that when we have economic shocks or any kind of recessionary shocks, this will not affect every region in the same way. right? We'll have some regions that will be severely affected by the recessions and some others that will be a little bit more resistant. So in some way, the idea is to try to understand why is that some regions are more resilient than others in terms of like their resistance or recovery capacity to economic shocks. And in some way to understand that, the first step was to try to measure, try to understand how is that we can quantify this idea of economic resilience. Another important point here that I'm highlighting in this slide is that recessionary shocks won't affect in the same way to all population groups. And although in this case, we were analyzing different geographical regions, here we want to highlight that, like for example, certain income groups will be less affected than other groups in terms of economic shocks. In this case, we're showing a sample of what was the last Great Recession in the United States, the one that happened back in 2008, 2010, and the recovery period after 2010 to 2014, in which we can see that high income groups were not that affected as low income and middle groups were affected. And the map in the left is showing how the distribution of changes in unemployment, were different across different counties, in this case in Indiana. So that's, one of the key things that we wanted to highlight here. Next slide, please. So just as Indraneel mentioned, there are different characteristics in terms of understanding resilience. As I said, it could be like a simple equilibrium type of way. There's some other ways to choose the ecological idea of resilience. And there's a third one called socio-ecological resilience, in which we will consider that the area of study could adapt organically or could change structurally to be able to recover and resist future shocks in the future, right? And in some way, one way to try to see this is just how this blue line that you can see there is like projecting what would be the normal trajectory of the projected growth in economy or any other variable that we're using. And then the red lines are showing possible changes that will happen after the shock, right? Like the part that you see there, the drop. Then after that, you could have like an improved like growth path. You could have the same growth path, or you could have like a diminished growth path. So in some way, we wanted to understand how is that we can measure this using some of these conceptual frameworks. Next slide, please. So in some way, the way that we try to measure that was using a very simple concept in economics called shift share analysis, in which the growth that we have in one specific region is supposed to follow the path that is given by let's say, the national employment trends, which is the first component there that you see there, NE, as well as the trend that is given by the industrial mix that we have in that particular region, right? Like for example, if in the United States, we are projecting that the employment growth will be like 5%, but then this region is growing 7%, then in some way we know that this 2% extra is because of some local capacity that this region has, and therefore that's related to the regional competitiveness or local competitiveness that region has. And in the case of the resilience metric, the way that we did this is just to try to understand what will be the projected growth during the period of the recession and the recovery period, and then what really happened during that period. And if the growth was higher than expected or the drop was lower than expected, then it means that that region was a little bit more resilient than the overall national trend. And also we were able to compare different regions. Next slide, please. So, and this is the results of those analyses. As you can see, the different geographical distribution of the metric of resilience. You could see in red areas that has significant drop in employment during the recession, but then in these regions after that, they were able to recover very quickly, which is showing green in the right map. Next slide, please. And we also assess what is called the spatial dependence in here. And this is a very important concept because in some way, the local capacity of one region to resist or recover from a recession is also depending on its relationship with the surrounding regions. So the way that we assess this is by using some spatial econometric models. And in this case, you could see the local indicators of a spatial association. And in red, what you will see is that the capacity to recover in some regions in the area, for example, of Michigan and Indiana, that are primarily manufacturing areas, are highly dependent on each other. Therefore, if one area is like recovering quickly, it's also influencing the areas around it, but it's also influenced by the areas that are around it. And contrary, in some areas that are lagging, the part in blue, some areas that are concentrated in one particular industry will also be lagging, as well as the surrounding areas, because they have concentrated in one or some type of particular industry, right? Next slide, please. And the last thing that we wanted to just understand is to assess the role of transportation infrastructure. And to do that, what we did is just to control for all of the variables that are important for economic resilience. And in the literature, you can find, it's like human capital, livability, industry structure, entrepreneurship, social capital, and of course, we wanted to assess the role of infrastructure and accessibility. And of course, we found a positive association after controlling for all those factors. That's pretty much, in a nutshell, the analysis that we did, and I'll pass it back to Son.
So, thank you, Davis, and very nice, maps and spatial analysis. Can you please tell a little bit more, how these spatial methods helped you in economic resilience analysis? What are their strengths? Thank you.
Yes. So one interesting thing about economic analysis is that although we are considering, let's say, these regions that are counties, we know that all these counties have economies that are connected with each other, right? And we could see this in the commuting patterns. For example, that one person might be living in this county and traveling in another county. The same for industries. Some industries may be able to have a labor market that, their employees are coming from this particular county, but at the same time, the market that they are supplying might be way beyond the county boundaries. Therefore, when we capture or try to capture this spatial dependence among different counties, we were able to understand not only that there's this spatial dependence that you saw in the map, that the regions depend on each other, but also that the variables that we are assessing here in this slide that in some way contribute to economic resilience will also vary in space, right? Like, for example, rail connectivity, which is one of the variables that we assess here, was most important in the area of Illinois and Indiana than, for example, in the area of Ohio, where, for example, highway accessibility was more important than rail connectivity, right? In some way, by using these spatial models, we can understand this non-stationarity of the data that sometimes we consider as standard when we just run a simple regression model or any kind of global model. But then when we try to assess this local association between the variables, we can understand some specific relationship that can allow us to design specific policies that might help us to improve the resilience capacity of these regions at the local level.
Thank you.
Thank you, Davis, and thank you, Indraneel. Very interesting also the application of spatial techniques. And now let me introduce you our next speaker, Losada-Rojas. She's assistant professor at University of New Mexico, and Lisa will share her experience on mixed method project to discover the impact of different factors that influence economic resilience. Lisa, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you everyone for attending today. So the presentation that I will be sharing, it's about a project that we conducted when I was at Purdue, that's titled Economic Resilience and Recovery in the U.S. Great Lakes Region, a Socioeconomic and Transportation Infrastructure Perspective. The project was funded by the USAID, and you can go next. So the main goals of the project was to uncover the significant socioeconomic and physical factors that might influence resilience. So for that, we have, you can click next. Yeah, two partners, the northwestern and the southeastern part of Indiana, which were our case study for this project. Next. So the project focused, and it was very nice that Davis kind of introduced the topic for me, we had, or we outlined the projects around the community capital frameworks, and we had 12 focus groups in different counties that were urban and rural counties. And through the focus group, we were trying to understand what of the measures of those community capitals were important for the next step of our analysis. You can click next. So those are the 12 counties that we study and had the focus group on. And after we did that, we run a structural equation model using secondary data that came mainly from publicly available sources. And the idea of that data was to understand whether those capitals had a connection within each other and what factors were adding to those capitals that at the same time were adding to the economic resilience of each of those counties. You can click next. So the results of this project were 2 different products. One of them, it's an online dashboard that allows these regions to understand their strengths and their weaknesses in the different factors that we were studying. And then the next result was a what if tool, and how we motivated the 2 regions to use this tool. It's trying to, or helping them to understand if we change a factor, how that's going to add to the economic resilience of the place. And I wanted to mention here, and along the lines of the discussion that Indraneel had earlier in the session, that the resiliency measure that we use for this specific study was the employment population ratio. So in this case, if you add 1 unit or 1 percentage point of female labor participation, we noticed that that was an important factor to also increase resilience or that employment population ratio by 0.28%. You can go next. So through the project, we identified various characteristics that add up to those community capitals. And we use past events such as an economic shock. And in the case of this project, I failed to mention that we were looking mainly at the Great Recession, 2008, 2009 in the US. And we use these events to understand the role of transportation in building more healthier and robust communities. Through the project, we also identify some short and long-term strategies. One of the main strategies or findings that caught my eye was the investment in infrastructures that allow non-motorized modes, such as walking and biking, and how those are very important to build or to make a community more resilient. And that was not only a finding that we got through the structural equation model, but also through the focus groups and communicating with different participants there. So I think in general, the project or having done the project as this mixed method was very useful to really draw policies for short and long term that were useful for the different communities. And I think that's all.
Thank you, Lisa. Very interesting and very different, right? So can you please tell a little bit more about the structural equation model that you use and how it helped you uncover the economic resilience parameters?
Yes. Sure. So as we know, economic resilience is not something that can be explained by only one measure, and that's where structural equation models comes into place. That it's allow us to build these different indicators or what it's called in the methodology latent variables. So what they are it's a variable that is composed by things that we can observe. So a latent variable would be something that we cannot observe, such a concept like human capital, right? Human capital means so many things when looking at the literature and also at the indicators that are available to measure that human capital. So to continue with that example of human capital, we use things such as the female labor participation, religious jobs, or any other measures that could be observed through available data to try to come up and understand what that human capital means for our regions, and then understand through that how that factor or that capital it's actually adding to resilience. And we did that with all the other capitals to try to understand how they add to economic resilience, but not only to economic resilience, but among them. So we also found that, for instance, a strong human capital, it's associated with a strong built environment capital. So everything that surrounds, or all the infrastructure that surrounds and allows regions to be more resilient. It also has an influence on that human capital that can be found in that region. So I think that's how using a structural equation models was very useful to understand the concept of economic resilience in this particular project.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Indraneel. Very interesting, the mixed method in evaluating resilience. And now let me introduce our next panelist, UK. UK is from Argonne National Lab. He has a PhD from Purdue University, and he will introduce anticipatory action in the context of resilience. The floor is yours, UK.
Thanks, Chun. So standard disclaimer, this is ongoing work I'm doing at Argonne National Lab. Anything I say is my opinion only. It doesn't represent that of the US government or any of its agencies. If I mention any companies, it's not an endorsement, and it's only to be used as an example. So that out of the way, I'll talk about anticipatory action. Usually it's in the case of natural disasters or socioeconomic trends or armed conflicts, and typically it's in the form of humanitarian interventions. But we can also kind of apply some of the key concepts to the US. There's some challenges associated with that, of course, since non-natural disaster shocks are a bit harder to predict with weather type shocks such as hurricanes or typhoons or whatnot. There's usually ample warning, and there's some time to prepare for that type of thing. But with economic shocks, it's at times more difficult to deal with. Sometimes you get lucky, and for instance, with major policy changes or evolving social trends, you might be able to kind of foresee potential problems within certain industries. So for an example, what I'm working on currently is looking at the effect of transportation electrification. So think electric vehicles for decarbonization goals in order to meet climate change goals. This has major implications for the automotive manufacturing industry. Next slide, please. So a bit unlike other industries with manufacturing, especially for vehicle manufacturing, there's a lot of upstream manufacturing that has to occur before an automobile is created. So with that in mind, there's a lot of stakeholders that need to kind of get on board, that need to be talked to, and these include labor unions, various levels of government, both local and federal, as well as the manufacturers themselves up and down the entire supply chain, and also finally the automaker themselves. And so because there's so many stakeholders, it's hard to get in touch with all of them, especially if there's, for instance, in the US right now, the UAW, the United Auto Workers, are in labor contract renegotiations with automakers, and so they don't really want to talk to anyone except for the automakers, and so it's there's just a lot going on in the background that also can impact how well your anticipatory action sort of like study goes. It's also difficult to identify the communities most at risk. With limited resources, we want to be able to kind of highlight, or kind of highlight is not the best word, but like, to kind of identify the communities that are going to be hit the hardest and deal with those as like a priority. But then within those communities, there's different political sensitivities that we have to kind of take account, as well as different attitudes towards interventions. With the U.S., for instance, not everyone is keen on government oversight or government intervention. So we have to kind of take into account of that when identifying the best pathway forward. And that kind of gets me to the last bullet point, which is identifying the least bad intervention strategy. I wanted to say the best, but that's probably too rosy of a picture. So like workforce development is commonly used in the resilience literature as like, oh yeah, we can improve resiliency by retraining the workforce to be able to do more things, but that's not super straightforward. One thing that we're trying to work on right now is helping upstream manufacturers identify alternate end-use industries. So for instance, during the 2008-2009 recession, we saw a lot of transmission manufacturers, so manufacturers that would make transmissions for cars, they would instead make similar parts for the aerospace industry. And so we're exploring whether or not that can take place again during this sort of ongoing transition towards electric vehicles, where manufacturers that make components that are no longer needed in those electric vehicles, so for instance, transmissions and engines and exhaust systems, if they can kind of like find a different industry to make their products for. And then finally, there's also the potential to have legislation that promotes reshoring of manufacturing or onshoring of manufacturing. So those are kind of the high level challenges with anticipatory action specific to the US and specific to auto manufacturing.
Thank you, and very interesting case and very important point. So whenever we are now going and working with regions on economic development, workforce is coming as a major issue, and especially the current situation, what we have here in the US. So can you expand a little bit on, the workforce development, as a challenge or maybe an area of opportunity?
Yeah, it's both an area of opportunity and a major challenge. And so, for instance, with workforce development, there are some things that kind of need to be taken into account that isn't always taken into account. For instance, if the workforce is aging, that matters a lot. Like if they're already going to kind of age out of the workforce, then like there's not a whole lot of gain in retraining the workforce in that community, right? Because they were about to retire anyway. So one example of this was maybe a couple decades ago. This is a couple decades ago. Like a lot of the people working in electric power generation were like in their 60s already. So like if back then we had swapped to some other technology like nuclear, then like there wouldn't have been any point in retraining that specific workforce because most of them were on their way to retirement anyway. With manufacturing and vehicles, we don't know. There's not a lot of good data, or there's not a lot of data, and the data that does exist isn't very good on like the age of like that workforce throughout the entire country. And so that's one of the major challenges. The other challenge is like kind of going towards who's going to do this workforce development. There's some tension within various states over like who's best to do workforce retraining. Is it the community colleges for like associate's degrees? Is it the manufacturing associations? Like who needs to be doing this, the actual like on the ground work? And so from the few thousand feet level, it's difficult to tell how to best implement it and where to implement it and to who should be, I guess, served with this workforce training.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, UK, and thank you, Indraneel. Very interesting question and points. And that brings to the end of the first part of the flash talk. And let me bring you to the second part of the talk. So now we're switching attention to a very different context, and we're now looking at Global South. For the Global South part, we have speakers from university and international organization. They will share their studies and practices in international context. And our first speaker, let me very pleased to introduce you, Professor Donato Romano. Professor, he's from University of Florence, also director of PhD program in development economics and local systems. Professor Donato Romano will talk about the relationship between resilience, vulnerability, and other aspects of concept and empirics. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Chun. My contribution would be rather different from the preceding ones because the development economists have worked both on, over the last decades or so, on applications, but also they work quite a lot on theoretical background that frames this issue of what resilience is and how it could be measured. And this is important, in my opinion, because as you have seen in the previous speakers, they are regional economists. They are talking about resilience at a very aggregate level. They are talking about some dimensions that are also quite aggregated. But you can have different scales, of course, right? Resilience could be at household level, individual level, it could be even at state level. Another issue could be, for instance, what is resilience, the nature of resilience. It is a capacity, as we have heard from Indraneel, or it is a condition, or it is a state. And also, we have already seen that there could be some differences in terms of the time frame where this resilience concept could be applied in terms of the response. Are we looking at a shorter or medium or longer run in terms of response? So basically, my point is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the conceptualization of the resilience concept. And the same applies also to some other well-established received concepts in economics, namely vulnerability. And this is why we decided recently, we published a paper that tried to make a systematic review of the similarities and differences and relationship between vulnerability and resilience. I have to say that after 10 years or so, we are a quite clear idea of what a theoretically sound conceptualization of resilience should be. Let me begin saying that, first of all, resilience is not old wine in new bottles. Resilience and vulnerability are not one the flip side of the other. For instance, you can think of somebody or a household that is vulnerable, it is not vulnerable, and this means automatically that it is resilient. Or you can think of a household that is not resilient, and again, you can conclude that in that case it is vulnerable. But still, you can have some vulnerable households that are yet resilient. Okay, so having clarified that, let me tell you what, in my opinion, are the two most important contributions from the theoretical viewpoint that we can think of. Resilience is important because it is an integrative concept that builds on two strands of literature in development economics, or say in economics. One is the vulnerability literature, because in the vulnerability literature, it is emphasized that there is a need of estimate both the conditional moments, conditional means and conditional variance, but usually this literature ignores what is the non-linear dynamics, prospective dynamics. On the other side, the second strand of literature is poverty traps literature, which instead focuses on nonlinearities in the prospective dynamics, but usually does not take into account higher order moments. Well, when we talk about resilience, it puts together those two things, because as in the case of vulnerability, it borrows from this literature the higher order conditional moments, and at the same time, it also considers nonlinearity in prospective dynamics as the poverty traps literature does. The second thing that I would like to emphasize is that when we look at a conceptualization of resilience, of course, we are doing that because we have in mind that this concept should be used in order to measure something. So we know that whatever the concept, it should be good enough to be able to measure the construct it is intended to do it. And here you can have several requirements from the theoretical point. The two most important, in my opinions, would be the first one, that is time requirements. The concept of resilience needs to be forward-looking. It should be something that make it possible for any meaningful policy use to anticipate, to predict what's going on. And the second one, it is the scale requirement, meaning that a good measure should be hopefully something that could be decomposable or aggregate across different scales. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there is a need for a dynamic setting and some predictive models that are conditional on the entire set of shocks, multiple scale shocks and stresses, as well as households' characteristics. And talking about this, there is at least one conceptualization that is the one that has been proposed quite recently by Chris Barrett and colleagues, that is the resilience as normative condition that met all these requirements. So everything is clear now, everything is okay. Well, not exactly, because from the empirical viewpoint, we know that there is a trade-off between theoretical sound concepts and data needs for the analysis. For instance, when we look at the measure as a conditional moment, this is very highly demanding in terms of data because it requires high frequency, micro level, good quality data, ideal at seasonal frequency, including the entire sets of the possible coverage and shocks that are seldom available in developing countries. On the other hand, if we go for ad hoc measure, this very likely could undermine the validity and the accuracy of the measure itself. But I will stop there, Chun, because I think that my 4 minutes have already expired.
Thank you, Professor. You actually used 3 minutes and 59 seconds. So that is perfect. It's a very interesting point you mentioned, the trade-off and the linkage between concept and data requirements, which is an empirical question. Just to follow up on that, I guess my question is, do you think since we have more data sources and more available information, this trade-off is somehow relaxed, or maybe we still face that constraint? Do you think the new data and the method are actually enhancing our conceptualization?
Well, let me tell you that now we are many more data available, and that's good. But we also have, and this is even more important, better quality data, and this can help for sure if you want to measure and to make some analysis with reference to resilience. Anyway, I think that you are thinking probably at LSMS like multi-purpose household surveys. Well, this is a starting point in my opinion, but it could be not all. As I told you before, in order to analyze resilience, to learn about the resilience, in order to understand where the building of resilience or strengthening resilience lies, we need to have better data that are probably produced through specific data generation processes. I repeat, we need to have high frequency panel data, that are able to capture, all the sets of coverage and shocks that can affect on that. An alternative strategy, actually a complementary strategy, I should say, could be probably the integration of this with some non-conventional data sources. I'm talking about massive crowd sources, citizen-generated data. This, in my opinion, could be quite a promising route. But again, in this case, even more than in the previous case, we needed to ensure the quality of the data that we have here. So in my opinion, the analysis of the data gaps and the promotion of the complementarity and the interoperability of those data is surely one of the field of research that we have to focus upon in the near future. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. That's a very insightful point. And with that, let me move on to the next speaker. Let me start sharing screen again. Okay. Our next speaker is Antonio Scognamillo from FAO. Antonio has been working with national government to implement policies in the wake of climate change. And Antonio will discuss the relationship between individuals that shapes the well-being dynamics. Thank you, Antonio, and let me pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Chun. Thank you, colleague, for this interesting symposium. I will immediately link to to Professor Romano points. Basically, we have been talking about the concept of resilience, the data that we need to measure resilience, but especially for what concerns development resilience, there is a big elephant in the room, and the fact that when the efficiency of this measure have been tested, they have been all proved to be at best imperfect and at worst deeply flawed. This has been tested through pseudo-out of sample analysis of the forecast performance of the indicator. And at the end of this analysis of the existing indicator of development economics, it is natural to think, what is the value added of this complex measure of resilience relatively to more tangible and also understandable for policymaker measure, such as the food consumption score or the real expenditure or some measure of assets accumulation. Next, please. This is not simple to respond. For what concerns the second question, so what is the value added of this complex measure of resilience? Since we know that the best predictor of the well-being of the unit of observation is or her lagged measure of well-being. So why we don't use just that to forecast their future status? Well, because we are interested mainly in individual and in a unit for which we cannot predict the future well-being through observing their past realization. This is one of the key concepts that underlying the concept of resilience. And the second one about the fact that the measure of resilience are all deeply flawed. Well, we can just read the previous literature, and it is clear that across different disciplines, and we have seen also the concept of economic resilience that have been presented by the colleague here at the symposium, researchers have identified a broader system of feedback that shape the individual and collective human agency as a prerequisite for enhancing the measure of resilience. This was already true for what concerned developmental resilience through many previous contributions. In particular, I cited this one of Barrett and Constance in 2014, but was never embedded so far into the measurement of this indicator. So the simple idea here was conditioning the household well-being to the spatial interaction within a given geographical scope to improve the prediction on the well-being dynamics. The idea is very simple. Basically, if I can translate in an easier way, this preamble was estimating the measure of resilience through different approach. In our paper that I have been happy to co-author with Chun and with Ada Inyashuk. We have basically expand the framework of System Barrett that Donato has introduced before. And the idea was basically to estimate this resilience indicator through spatial econometric model in order to embed this spatial structure that underlying the human relationship within the measure of resilience. And the outcome prove here that doing that, the error of prediction of the resilience measurement has substantially decreased relatively to the parent methodology. The idea, to use other words, is that if we want to measure the resilience, we need to take into account also the resilience of the surrounding neighboring, because the resilience of a single unit depends on the resilience of the other unit that surround that specific unit that we are going to consider. So if I live in an environment in which I am surrounded by resilient individual, my probability to be resilient is higher, and the other way around. This concept has been the idea of this paper that I was previously mentioning, Novenis and Alan, that has been recently published on World Development. Just to self-promoted the paper, since there is still 50 days of free access, you can download it through the link or through the QR code here on the slide. Over to you, Chun.
Thank you, Antonio, for the advertisement. I think World Development will be very happy for that commercial. I was about to show you this, but you finished on time. I guess my follow-up question, if you can just very, very briefly answer, is that in your opinion, what would be the next step in digging further into measuring resilience?
Yes, we have told that I didn't say that, but basically in the paper we told that this is only a step toward capturing the complex system and human society interaction in shaping resilience. And I guess that the next step is to try to capture these systems, this network structure that underlying the resilience through other factors that not necessarily are linked to the spatial structure. In our application, we use the spatial structure because it was a non-expensive way, okay, to model an additional information. Every household survey now comes from geographical coordinates. So we have just used what was already available. And actually, without any additional cost, we basically improve the forecasting performance of the indicator. I guess that, and this will be more difficult, okay, including new factor that may help to map this complex system and interaction will still improve this forecasting performance. Over.
Thank you, Antonio. That's a very nice summary of this improvement. Now, let me introduce you to our next speaker, Kelvin. Kelvin is economist at the International Livestock Research Institute, and he will talk about insurance and the role played by high-frequency data and monitoring tools. Over to you, Kelvin. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Chun, and hello, everyone. So I'll talk about those two topics. One about the work that we are doing at ILRI around financial inclusion and how that can contribute to resilience building, and then as well as the work we are doing around high frequency data and how that can help in resilience measurement. So on the first topic, societies tend to construct gender along many dimensions, in terms, for example, of expenditure responsibility, in terms of risk exposure, domains of economic activity, networks through which information is shared and learning occurs, etc. Right? But this also then means that if we take a gender-blind approach to resilience programming, this may not work, and so there's really need to be gender intentional in our effort to combine, women assets building with asset protection, especially in pastoralist setups. And so there's this NGO called BOMA project that has been, it's an international NGO that has been implementing a graduation program. And this basically what they, this program helps to build tangible assets, but also intangible psychological assets for ultra poor women in Kenya's arid and semi-arid lands. And so early, evaluations showed that there was significant increase in productive assets, in family cash incomes, as well as women's savings. But the question is whether these impressive gains for women can survive the next climatic shock. As you can imagine, not, and we've seen in our data that when shocks happen, the assets that had been accumulated drop significantly. And so then we started to think about how we can somehow combine asset building with insurance-based asset protection, and whether this potential can be realized with index-based livestock insurance. But the first level problem here was that the economic activity that can be directly indexed, in this case forage availability on open rangelands, was tied to what is construed or constructed as a male activity, right? Livestock herding. So this posed the question whether rangelands were really or are relevant to women's responsibility and whether that can be made salient to them. So we conducted an experiment testing two approaches. One, we provided standard, we framed livestock in terms of livestock insurance in terms of the standard tropical livestock units. And in another arm, we framed this in terms of, we emphasized the women's indirect exposure to rangeland risks and the benefits of buying, household or family insurance that pays off, when rangeland conditions are bad. And so what we found here is that the family insurance presentation increased number of sales of insurance, but also actually increased the sum insured by substantial amounts. And we are talking about 20% and 40% respectively. And so a key lesson here is that, when insurance speaks to the needs of women and provides a chance to experiment, we see that the impacts can be large. But what else can be done here? So we are currently implementing what we are calling a visa model. So this is basically the idea that we encourage women to save so that they can use those savings to purchase insurance. So this is the village insurance savings account approach. And so the idea is that the visa approach, promises to relax both the information access and financial constraints that likely constrain women's understanding and purchase of insurance. We are already seeing some promising results, but we are still in the process of analyzing those data. But coming to the measurement issue, we are currently implementing some efforts around what we call sentinel zones in pastoral areas of Kenya. So these are basically geographical areas where we monitor important indicators of resilience at the markets level, at the rangeland level. So we have things called transect site, for example, and as well as at the household level to understand how different indicators are changing, right? And so at the market level, for example, we look at what's happening in terms of livestock body conditions, livestock volumes, livestock prices. At the rangeland level, we monitor at weekly frequency what's happening in terms of forage availability and suitability. And the household level, we look at what's happening in terms of food consumption patterns. And so these high frequency data are helpful in the sense that they help us to see or to be able to identify shocks when they're beginning to happen. And so that can inform pastoralists, but also other stakeholders to intervene early before the shocks can be catastrophic. So let me pause there and yeah, back to you. Thanks, Chun. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelvin. I think financial inclusion, it is a very important concept in this context. The question I have is that we know for pastoralism community, they have some particular characteristics compared to sedentary farmers, right? The question I have is that when you're implementing those programs and interventions, are you facing particular challenges because of the characteristics of pastoralism communities?
Yeah, as you said, these setups tend to be quite different from the, like from typical farmer setups, but they also tend to be more vulnerable, right? I mean, we know frequency of shocks and intensity, has really been intensifying. We are really not, so the challenge here would be in terms of, even if they save, because the groups we work with, for example, have already been engaging in some sort of saving for their businesses, right, to invest in their businesses. But when shocks happen, and given the covariant nature of these shocks, they tend to wipe away the little savings that women had been, had accumulated. And so in terms of implementation, it's rather that they themselves were also thinking about something else that could help them become even more resilient. And so for us then that was, made a little bit the implementation easier. But outside the pastoralist setup, you can imagine that, droughts are things that are affecting people more broadly, right? And so, and then the group structures that I mentioned are things that are not unique in pastoralist setups, but also elsewhere. And so I can also see that the approach that we implement, although in our case, because we target livestock insurance as a product, this is something that could apply, for example, more broadly for, for example, whether insurance elsewhere, even in the crop or in other farming contexts. And similarly, for the high frequency data, we are now increasingly seeing that being incorporated in other value chains, outside pastoralist setups. So I think I would say that the approach is applicable, widely, both in pastoral and non-pastoral setups.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelvin. And last but not least, let me introduce our last speaker of the panel, Elisabetta Gator. Elisabetta is the principal scientist at the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT, CGIAR. And Elisabetta will share her view on how crop diversification will help farmers improve their resilience. Over to you, Elisabetta.
Thank you, Chun. Can you hear me well? I hope my internet connection it's good. Thank you, Chun, for organizing this very interesting symposium. My first reaction to all this is that we should define resilience. There is a category, a professional category missing here, the agronomist, the crop genetist, that would definitely give a different definition to resilience. So I think here the first point is, and this was also said before, what are the indicators of resilience we want to measure? How do we define resilience? Is it resilience of the humans, the actors, as we were discussing before, the resilience of the farming system, and therefore the impact on the livelihood of people? So I think the terms resilience has to be defined and contextualized always, because can have different meaning and different entry points depending on the background of the analyst. In the past 10-15 years, have been analyzing the role that agrobiodiversity, crop diversity, and varietal diversification is playing in increasing the resilience of the farming system. So the question here was to what extent can agrobiodiversity help farming system to buffer against adverse environmental conditions, and therefore, how can we increase the capacity of farmers to deal with biotic and abiotic stress? Can agrobiodiversity play a role on this? We tested this hypothesis in different farming systems, focusing mainly on smallholder farming system. By smallholder farming system, we mean smallholders that do not have access to inputs, do not often have access to water. So they really have to create a farming system that is enabling them to deal with all the shocks that are happening on an everyday basis now. We tested our hypothesis, as I say, in different contexts, in sub-Saharan Africa, in India. We worked a lot in the Altiplano Sud of Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, and we really wanted to see to what extent on-farm conservations of ancient crops and their diversity could help farmers to deal with shock. And here the major question was, what are the incentives we can give to farmers or farmers can get out of the diversity they need to conserve, so that we can create a sustainable mechanism that is enabling the farming system to increase the resilience and the capacity to buffer the shocks. We worked, I can bring you here the example, for instance, in Latin America, as I say, in the Altiplano of Peru and Bolivia, in which we were looking at the value chain of the ancient grain and to what extent the conservation of the diversity could provide livelihood incentives to farmers that were then conserving and continuing to maintain the crop diversity that was then having environmental outcome. So here it's very much important also when we talk about resilience and agrobiodiversity to understand what are the outcomes we want to maximize. The major outcome when we talk about resilience and agrobiodiversity are environmental outcomes. So the question here, the research question is, what is the role that productivity, income, generations out of agrobiodiversity can play so that farmers can continue maintaining in the long term the diversity they have in the field. So the agrobiodiversity is definitely playing a key role in all this. We have seen it. The question is, how do we ensure the long-term maintenance of this agrobiodiversity, because there is the tendency of eroding it in the long run. So this is the big research questions we need to focus and continue working on.
Thank you, Elisabetta. I think you raised an important dimension, the environmental and sustainable development dimension. And from that, we know there has been an argument, also a discussion in literature about the trade-off, right? We know specialization, which is the other strategy, can also improve efficiency in the short run, whereas diversification is what you mentioned, it may benefit in the long run and may sometimes sacrifice efficiency in the short term. I guess my question is, in your opinion, do you think that trade-off exists? Is there a way to achieve both diversification, resilience, and also efficiency through specialization?
This is an interesting question related to what I was mentioning before. What is the outcome here we want to maximize? Of course, if we want to increase productivity and income, the answer is not crop diversity, but we have learned from the past that productivity and income is not sufficient in order to have sustainability, in order to have long-term benefits. So here the issue is, how can we offset the high cost or cost we can incur in the short term to maintain biodiversity in order to have then benefits that are occurring in the long run. And here that's why we need to measure the environmental benefits that goes beyond productivity and income. It's like the insurance value that agrobiodiversity can play and have. So it's not either or, it's to create a system that is generating livelihood benefits in the short terms that are incentivizing farmers to maintain agrobiodiversity in the long run so that we can have higher environmental benefits.
Thank you, Elisabetta. That's a very good point. With that, that's the end of the panel flash talk. For me, what's very intriguing is that despite all the different contexts and different conceptualization, different methods, we see very clear there are some insights that are common. There are many lessons are very closely related, both in the US and in the global South. With that, I would like to bring you all to the panel discussion. Let me start sharing my screen again. For this part, I would like to bring a question to all of our panelists. And we also invite the audience to join us in thinking it together and probably share your reflections later. So for this part, let me invite our speakers to join me in a very realistic scenario, okay? It's a hypothetical, but it's not entirely imaginary. So imagining that after this symposium, you're having dinner or lunch with Elon Musk and your uncle. Okay, as you see, this it's a pizza lunch or dinner. So when you're having lunch or dinner with them, you start describing the symposium and how excited you found it is, but they're not very impressed. Okay, they don't find it very useful. And your uncle and Elon Musk ask 2 questions to you. So what I would invite our speakers to think is you can choose one of the person to address and share with you what do you think, okay? So first question is from your uncle. He says, what's the point of inventing so many complex concepts? In my opinion, you're just using this to raise funding, okay? So that's the critique from your uncle. And then following that, Elon Musk asked another point. He said, well, I see your point, but the disruption that affects everyone the most are those that no one can anticipate. Think about COVID, right? Then is it even possible for us to be resilient to something that we never experienced before? So these are the critiques you have during your lunch, dinner, or snack time with these 2 people. So what I would like to invite our speaker is you can choose one of them as your target and let us know, in your opinion, what would your response be? In the meanwhile, for our audience, please feel free to post your comments and questions in the chat box. We will definitely address them. And if you have any other points you want to ask a particular speaker, you can also put in the chat. So I see, Professor, you just unmuted yourself. Would you like to take the mic?
Yes, I would like to respond to the first question, the one on the left-hand side.
Okay.
Why inventing so complex concept? Because the world is complex. And, you know, we have a lot of experience of very simplistic frameworks that then headed to the wrong solutions or, say, policy design. Again, when we talk about resilience, I think that from the practical viewpoint, this concept becomes a hot topic because there is a call, at least from the global south, of putting together, overcoming the divide between humanitarian interventions versus developmental interventions. So this is the main reason for the version of this concept in the policy arena, in development policy arena, which means also that you have to focus not only to, I would say, curative responses after a shock take place, but also preventative measures that can increase your adaptive capacity, your absorption capacity, et cetera, et cetera. And this is partially also a response to Elon Musk, because even though we do not know what the future will bring us, probably if we will be able to increase the capacity of a household, of say a community or a region to absorb and adapt to unprecedented shocks or unexpected shocks, this is something that is good. So the bottom line message is better to try to anticipate rather than simply to try to cure after. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor. That's actually a nice answer to both of your dinner guests. So do we have anyone else from the panel who would like to share their view on this?
May I? It is
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, I will try to address also both with the same argument. What we try to tell here that resilience is a systemic concept. So you cannot build the resilience of only one part of the system if you are not dealing with the resilience of the whole system in a way. So this answer partially to the uncle, because the systems are complex. And so we need a complex measure as well that is able to get at that level, the same level of complexity at least. And for Elon Musk, about the possibility that the disruption cannot be forecasted, and it's in line with Donato. If we do something to build systemic resilience, whatever will be the disruption in the future, you will be more resilient. Okay, you don't need to address a specific type of disruption. Resilience should be built at the systemic level, and this will increase the probability to be resilient to different type of disruption, including those that are difficult to forecast. Over.
Thank you, Antonio and Elisabetta.
Yes, I would like to echo what Antonio just said, that is, it's important and is the system approach. Here we're talking about food system that has to be understood not as a whole, and the interactions, the trade-off of the system. And we need to understand this complexity. We need to try to measure this complexity. What is true in one ecosystem or in one environmental zone is different from another. We have complexity here across scale, across system, across nations. So the more we try to understand, the better. And so we need to deal with the complexity. This is key.
Thank you, Elisabetta. I think it's Davis raised your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, just to add to what just was shared on the importance of considering these complex systems, right? Like we have seen even the concept of resilience evolving, from, in the write-up from Holland, from like single equilibrium, this engineering resilience to ecological resilience to what now is called socio-ecological resilience, that recognize that, these ecological systems and social systems are all interconnected. And the reason to do that is to try to understand the role that humans and social systems really play to make systems, like we're talking about like transportation, we're talking about farming systems, but it's really the humans who will make these systems more resilient. And why this is important is because the outcomes of these resilience shocks will actually have important impacts on certain populations, right? And we saw this with the past shock that affected African Americans, Hispanic, young people of low level of education. So in some ways, that's the reason why we need to understand this complexity, right? To really understand the human inputs, but also the human impacts of it.
Thank you, Davis. That's a very important point. I think we're running out of time, and we have heard a lot of very nice discussions between the panelists and the way they address the questions. Let me just quickly wrap up. I think it's a very nice chance that we can hear many perspectives from different angles. And we hope that you learn something new from this symposium that may be also thought-invoking. After all, we live in a very uncertain world, right? And the ability to deal with that is very important. So thank you all for joining us today. And I also see many of our very good colleagues coming to this symposium. Sarah and Joshua, thanks for coming. And everyone, thank you very much for joining us. And we also look forward to the discussion with you in the future as well. So thanks everyone. And I hope you have a good lunch or dinner.